Welcome to Last Records. Today, I'm uncovering the silliest ways people met their end stories so absurd they sound impossible, yet somehow happen. From a man who thought he could hold a lit firework in his hand for minutes, to a man who wrapped his shoes in plastic before walking into floodwater, only to make a mistake he couldn't undo. It was March 3rd, 2016, a cool morning in a residential neighborhood of College Park, Georgia. A law enforcement vehicle slowly entered the apartment complex as the city was beginning its usual day. Prescott Mensah was 29 years old and had spent most of his life in the College Park area after being raised by a relative who worked at the local airport. He was struggling with financial pressures and outstanding debts, so he supported himself through part-time food deliveries and occasional package-running jobs for a small distribution operation. He lived with his girlfriend, Liza Reeves, a 27-year-old home care aide who often worked overnight shifts. Prescott also had a mild asthma condition that, honestly, he never really treated. Prescott often left early for delivery assignments without waking Liza after one of her overnight shifts. That morning, when Prescott noticed a law enforcement vehicle entering the apartment complex, he panicked after spotting officers he believed had come to arrest him. Prescott had recently missed a court appearance related to a misdemeanor charge and feared he might be taken into custody. While Liza rested after finishing her overnight shift, Prescott searched the apartment for somewhere to hide. With nowhere else to go, he removed clothing and blankets from a large suitcase in the bedroom, squeezed inside, and pulled the zipper nearly closed, leaving only a small opening for air. Shortly afterward, officers arrived at the apartment. Awakened by a knock at the door, Liza spoke with them and gave permission to search the residence. Because Prescott often left early for deliveries without waking her, she assumed he had already gone to work and had no reason to believe he was still inside the apartment. They checked common hiding places and briefly noticed the suitcase, but nothing seemed unusual. After completing the search, they left without finding Prescott inside. It's strange to think something that was right there could still be overlooked. Although Prescott heard the officers leave, he worried they might still be nearby or return at any moment. Wanting to avoid being discovered, he remained inside the suitcase longer than he had intended. After the search ended, Liza went back to bed and quickly fell asleep. Curled tightly inside the confined space, Prescott had little room for his chest to expand. Anxiety quickened his breathing, while his untreated asthma made every breath more difficult. Though the suitcase was not airtight, poor ventilation allowed exhaled carbon dioxide to build up around him, causing headaches, dizziness, and growing confusion. As his condition worsened, Prescott tried to shift his body and pull the zipper farther open. But wedged tightly against the hard shell, he barely had enough room to move or generate enough leverage to open it. The more he struggled, the more exhausted he became, while the combination of panic, worsening respiratory distress, and the cramped position steadily reduced his ability to escape. Before long, he could barely reposition himself. As his breathing grew more labored, he became increasingly disoriented, and even shouting became difficult. Struggling for air, his ability to think clearly, react, and call for help steadily faded. It's hard for me to picture having almost no space to move when trying to get out. Later that morning, Liza woke and noticed Prescott's keys and wallet were still inside the apartment. Realizing he likely hadn't left after all, she called his name but received no response. As she looked around the bedroom, she noticed the suitcase appeared unusually distorted. When she unzipped it, she found him motionless inside. Emergency responders were called immediately, but after assessing him and finding no signs of life, he was pronounced dead at the scene. My heart goes out to Liza having to walk into that moment inside their own home. Investigators later concluded that Prescott's death resulted from confinement-related asphyxia. The tightly compressed position of his body likely impaired normal breathing, while prolonged confinement inside the suitcase further compromised respiration. Evidence at the scene indicated that he had entered the suitcase on his own, and investigators found no signs of assault or involvement by another person. In the end, Prescott's attempt to avoid a brief encounter with authorities placed him in far greater danger than the one he feared. A hiding place chosen in panic became a fatal trap, turning a momentary decision into an irreversible outcome. Up next, a young mechanic becomes convinced he can control the timing of a firework that was never designed to be held in the first place. It was July 4th, 2018, a warm summer evening in a rural community near Harlan County, Kentucky. The smell of charcoal, fireworks, and cookout food drifted through the area as neighbors celebrated the holiday. Malachi Beam was a 23-year-old mechanic who worked at a small local repair shop. Having left school early to enter the workforce, he spent several years building a reputation as a skilled worker who was confident with tools and machinery. Friends described him as energetic and adventurous, often willing to take unnecessary risks for a laugh or a challenge. challenge. He lived alone in a modest rental home and spent most weekends with the same close-knit group of friends. Malachi was healthy, physically active, and had no significant medical conditions. That evening, Malachi gathered with several friends for a backyard Independence Day celebration. Food, drinks, music, and fireworks filled the night as the group enjoyed the holiday. Earlier in the evening, they had launched several consumer-grade fireworks without any problems. Among the collection were artillery-style shells designed to be placed into a launch tube before ignition. I'd probably think nothing was wrong at first, because everything was going smoothly. For most of the night, Malachi was using the fireworks the way they were supposed to be used. He'd place a shell into the tube, light the fuse, and step back before it launched into the sky. But after several hours of drinks and a string of successful launches, well, he started getting a little too comfortable. He began lighting shells and holding them for a few seconds before dropping them into the tube, treating each launch like a game. The thing is, every time it worked, it seemed to make him more confident. Before long, he was acting like he'd figured out some secret about how the fuses worked. Friends warned him that fireworks don't always behave the same way, but by that point, Malachi seemed to think he could outguess a lit explosive. Later that evening, he picked up another artillery shell and lit the fuse. Instead of immediately dropping it into the launch tube, he held it in his right hand and began counting aloud, treating a lit explosive like a stopwatch. Witnesses later recalled shouting at him to let go. Investigators were never able to determine whether he counted too long or whether the fuse burned faster than expected. Either way, his plan relied on being better at predicting a burning fuse than the burning fuse itself. If it were me holding that shell, I know I'd be trying to get rid of it the second something felt wrong. The answer came only seconds later. The firework detonated while still in his hand. Everything happened at once. The shell exploded before Malachi could let go, and because he was still holding it, the blast tore directly into his hand and forearm. His right hand was devastated by the explosion, and his wrist was severely damaged. Fragments from the shell and nearby debris struck his arm, face, and neck, while the blast also left him with serious burns. Emergency services were contacted immediately as Malachi's friends rushed to help, using clothing and towels in an attempt to slow the severe bleeding. Despite their efforts, the injuries were catastrophic. Severe trauma to the hand and wrist caused rapid blood loss, and by the time emergency responders reached the rural property, Malachi had suffered irreversible physiological collapse and could not be saved. Investigators later determined that the shell had detonated while still in Malachi's hand, exposing him directly to the blast and fragmentation effects. Witnesses reported that several people had warned him against repeating the stunt earlier in the evening, but he had continued despite their concerns. After investigators completed their work, the remaining fireworks were discarded. Friends and relatives later described the tragedy as a sobering reminder of how quickly a familiar holiday activity can become deadly when basic safety precautions are ignored. I had done it before without a problem, so I assumed nothing would happen this time either. From a backyard fireworks display, we moved to a repair job in Arizona where a routine electrical task takes a deadly turn. It was September 8, 2015, a hot morning in a residential neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. A routine home repair job was scheduled at a house where a faulty laundry room outlet had recently begun showing signs of electrical problems. Wiley Vela was a 41-year-old self-employed handyman who had spent nearly a decade performing small repair jobs throughout the area. Most of his work came through recommendations from previous customers, and he handled a variety of household repairs, including painting, plumbing, drywall, and basic electrical work. Although he lacked formal certification, Wiley had gained practical experience over the years and was generally viewed as dependable by his clients. He lived alone, stayed involved in his teenage son's life, and managed high blood pressure with inconsistent medication use. That morning, Wiley arrived at a homeowner's residence to replace a malfunctioning outlet located behind a washing machine in the laundry room. Before beginning the repair, he flipped what he believed was the correct breaker and returned to the laundry room. Wiley wasn't carrying a voltage tester that day, but honestly, he didn't think he needed one. In his mind, he'd already flipped the breaker, so the problem was solved. What he didn't know was that the outlet was still connected to a different circuit and remained live. The strange part was that the one thing he didn't check was the only thing that mattered. There were no sparks, unusual sounds, or other obvious signs that power was still present. The homeowner mentioned a minor washing machine leak from earlier that morning and suggested waiting a little longer before working behind the machine, but Wiley wasn't concerned. Well, as far as he knew, the power was already off. Convinced it was safe, he removed the cover plate and reached toward the exposed wiring. The moment his fingers touched the energized terminal screws, electrical current entered his body. At the same time, he was in contact with the metal frame of the washing machine. With the appliance connected to the home's grounding system, his body became part of of the electrical path, allowing current to pass through his chest. That's the kind of moment that scares me because there's no warning before it happens. The shock lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The current caused his muscles to lock up and for a moment couldn't let go. When the connection finally broke, he stumbled backward and slammed into the wall. Everything happened incredibly fast. Elsewhere in the house, the homeowner heard the impact and rushed to see what had happened. She found Wiley on the floor, unresponsive and breathing irregularly. Emergency services were called immediately while she remained nearby awaiting assistance. Responders arrived within minutes and began extensive resuscitation efforts. Although responders briefly restored a pulse during resuscitation efforts, his condition remained critical and deteriorated during transport to a nearby medical facility. Despite continued treatment, Wiley could not be saved and was later pronounced dead. Investigators later determined that the outlet was still powered because it belonged to a different circuit than the breaker Wiley had switched off. What followed wasn't the result of a rare electrical failure or a complicated repair. It began with a mistaken assumption that the outlet was no longer live. The homeowner later hired a licensed electrician to complete the job, while family members discovered contractor licensing study materials among Wiley's belongings, evidence that he had recently begun taking steps toward obtaining formal qualifications. For me, that last detail is the saddest part, because he was still working toward improving himself. Our next story follows another man who trusted his own understanding of risk, this time during a body armor demonstration in Kentucky. It was August 17, 2019, a warm evening in a rural area of Breathitt County, Kentucky. A small group of friends gathered in an open field behind a private property as daylight faded and preparations were made for an unusual demonstration. Lysander Dunst was 34 years old and worked at a warehouse, but a lot of his weekends were spent buying and reselling used firearms, tactical gear, and military surplus items around eastern Kentucky. He had no formal training in ballistics or protective equipment, but he'd spent years reading about both and was often the person friends turned to when they had questions about firearms or gear. Lysander was married, had 2 young children, and was generally seen as responsible and careful, though at times he put a little too much faith in his own research. Several weeks before the incident, Lysander bought a used body armor vest that he originally planned to resell, but the more he thought about it, the more interested he became in testing it himself. Confident in the vest's protective rating, he invited his brother-in-law and 2 friends to a demonstration where a handgun round would be fired into the vest while the whole thing was recorded. A simple gear test sounds harmless on the surface, but this was already becoming a much bigger risk. Although some of those present expressed concern, Lysander believed the test would be safe. Investigators later found that the ammunition used for the demonstration exceeded the vest's intended protection rating, while the vest itself also showed signs of significant age-related wear factors that likely contributed to its failure. As the demonstration began, Lysander put on the vest over a t-shirt and positioned himself against a tree. The phone continued recording as his friend raised the handgun. Witnesses later stated that the shooter appeared reluctant to proceed and voiced concerns about the demonstration. Lysander reassured him and again insisted that the test continue. Moments later, the trigger was pulled. My stomach drops at the thought of everyone standing there knowing they were about to try this. The bullet struck the center of the vest, but the armor didn't stop it. The round punched through and entered Lysander's chest, inflicting a catastrophic injury to his heart. Within moments, severe internal bleeding began, and his condition started to deteriorate rapidly. I keep thinking about how everyone there expected the vest to protect him. For several seconds, Lysander remained standing. Witnesses recalled that he looked downward in apparent confusion before slowly collapsing against the tree. His friends rushed to help while emergency services were contacted. Following instructions from emergency dispatchers, they attempted to assist him while monitoring his condition. As his responsiveness rapidly declined, there was little they could do to address the severe internal injuries. Lysander remained conscious only briefly before becoming unresponsive. Responders arrived and transported him to a regional medical facility, but the damage to his heart proved unsurvivable. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Investigators determined that the body armor had significant age-related wear and that the ammunition used exceeded the vest's intended protection rating. Witness statements consistently indicated that the demonstration had taken place at Lysander's repeated request and that those present had expressed concerns beforehand. After reviewing the circumstances, prosecutors declined to pursue charges against the friend who fired the shot. In the aftermath, he withdrew from shooting activities and relocated from the area, while Lysander's family used savings he had set aside for a future business venture to help cover household expenses and support his children. Following that tragedy, we travel to flood-ravaged Houston, where confidence in familiar surroundings leads to another fatal decision. It was August 28, 2017, a flood-stricken day in a residential neighborhood of Houston, Texas. Days of severe weather had left streets submerged beneath murky water that appeared calm on the surface despite continuing to move through the area. Benson Watts was a 36-year-old receiving dock supervisor at a large distribution warehouse. Co-workers described him as dependable, hardworking, and determined, sometimes to the point of ignoring advice once he had made up his mind. He had spent most of his life in the neighborhood and was familiar with seasonal flooding, having experienced several flood events without serious consequences. Benson lived with his girlfriend Tamara and helped care for her young son. He considered himself a capable swimmer and often felt confident around water, believing his past experiences had prepared him for most situations. As the floodwaters continued to rise, Benson decided he needed to retrieve his pickup truck parked several hundred yards away. Neighbors urged him to wait, warning him that the water was unpredictable, but Benson believed it was just a short walk through familiar territory. He even took off his shoes, sealed them inside a plastic bag, and tucked them into his waistband before stepping into the floodwater. There's something a little ridiculous about looking at a flood and deciding the biggest concern is what might happen to your shoes. I'd probably underestimate that water too if I only looked at the surface. At first, his progress appeared steady as he moved carefully through the murky water, feeling for stable footing beneath the surface. To nearby observers, it seemed he was crossing safely. What Benson could not see was that flooding had altered the roadway below him. Investigators later found evidence of erosion and washouts in the area, creating hidden hazards beneath the muddy water. As he continued forward, one foot suddenly dropped into a washed-out section, causing him to lose his balance and fall into the current. The scary part here is that everything looked fine from above, even though the road underneath had changed. The moving water immediately carried him away from his intended path. Benson had always been comfortable around water, but floodwater was nothing like a pool or a calm swimming area. Benson had crossed flooded areas before, and somewhere along the way, he'd started treating past success as proof that floodwater followed the same rules every time. Unfortunately, floodwater was not interested in honoring Benson's previous experience. Neighbors later reported seeing him struggle as the current pushed him farther down the flooded street. As he was swept along, the current carried Benson toward a drainage structure beneath a nearby roadway. The closer he got, the stronger the water became. Moments later, he was pulled against a metal drainage grate, where the force of the rushing water pinned him in place. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. Unable to pull away from the grate or keep his head above water, Benson was repeatedly forced beneath the surface. He eventually lost consciousness and drowned before rescuers could reach him. His body was recovered after flood conditions improved, and search teams were able to safely access the drainage area where he had become trapped. The plastic bag containing his shoes was still secured at his waist. Oddly enough, the one part of Benson's plan that worked perfectly was the part involving the shoes. Seeing that small detail about his shoes makes the whole scene feel even more real to me. The discovery brought an end to the search that had begun when he was swept away by the floodwaters. In the months that followed, Tamara relocated with her son to be closer to relatives. At Benson's workplace, co-workers honored a tradition he had started by donating food in his memory to local flood relief efforts, continuing the gesture for several years after his death. I had crossed water before, and I convinced myself this time would be no different. Up next, what begins as harmless entertainment in a Pittsburgh parking lot quickly spirals out of control. It was October 18th, 2014, a quiet Saturday night in Pittsburgh's South Hills. A nearly empty shopping center parking lot sat above a steep access road that descended toward a nearby intersection. Finn Albrecht was 18 years old, a high school junior who balanced classes with a part-time retail job and spent most of his free time hanging out with a small group of friends. Known for his humor and easygoing personality, he was well-liked by classmates, co-workers, and teachers alike. Finn had played school sports, was saving up for a used car, and split his time between his parents after their divorce. Healthy and active, he rarely found himself in serious trouble. That evening, Finn and 3 friends stopped by a grocery store before heading back out to the parking lot. As they walked through the nearly empty area, one of them spotted an abandoned shopping cart near the cart return. Looking for something to do, the group pushed the cart down a steep access road and watched it race downhill before crashing harmlessly at the bottom. At first, it was just a joke, but almost immediately, it gave them another idea. This is the kind of thing where, if it were me, I'd probably laugh at first without thinking about where it could lead. After a few jokes about riding the cart, Finn volunteered before anyone else could. His friend suggested a position they thought might make the ride a little more stable, though in reality, none of them had any way of controlling the cart once it started rolling downhill. With everyone watching, Finn crouched inside the cart and held onto the front section. A friend gave the cart a push, sending it rolling down the hill. At first, the ride appeared successful. The cart gathered speed rapidly as gravity pulled it downhill. Witnesses later recalled seeing Finn smiling during the opening moments of the descent. None of the teenagers had discussed how he would stop or what would happen when he reached the bottom of the hill. As the cart accelerated, however, its small wheels began to wobble violently. Shopping carts are designed for flat parking lots and store aisles, not steep downhill travel at high speeds. With no brakes or steering controls, Finn had no practical way to regain stability once the cart began shaking. That's the part that stands out to me, because the cart was never built for what they were asking it to do. Partway down the slope, the cart's unstable front wheels encountered an uneven section of pavement. Combined with the growing wobble, the impact caused the cart to suddenly tip sideways. Finn was thrown from the cart and slammed onto the roadway. The left side of his head struck the pavement first, followed by his shoulder and upper body. The impact caused a severe head injury, including a skull fracture and traumatic damage to the brain. The cart continued downhill without him and crashed near the intersection below. The hardest part is how 1 second he was riding down the hill and the next his friends were running toward him. His friends immediately ran down the hill and called emergency services. When they reached him, Finn was unconscious but still breathing, with visible signs of a serious head injury. He was transported to a nearby medical facility where imaging revealed severe intracranial bleeding and traumatic brain injury. Despite emergency treatment, including surgery to relieve pressure within the skull, the damage proved irreversible and he never regained consciousness. In the months that followed, the incident was frequently discussed among students and parents in the area as an example of how quickly a seemingly harmless stunt can become life-threatening. Several of Finn's friends received counseling, while his family established a small scholarship in his memory at his high school. Our final story takes us to the mountains of Virginia, where a photographer searching for the perfect angle encounters an unexpected hazard. It was June 14, 2020, a clear morning in Rockingham County, Virginia. A rocky overlook above the Shenandoah Valley was bathed in soft sunlight as hikers and wildlife slowly emerged for the day. Matthias Tiago was a 31-year-old office worker from the Harrisonburg area who spent much of his free time hiking and photographing nature. Friends described him as quiet, patient, and deeply interested in landscapes and wildlife. He regularly explored trails throughout the region with his camera and was comfortable on hiking paths, but he had little experience with technical climbing terrain and did not use specialized safety equipment. That morning, he set out alone to photograph views from a favorite overlook. After reaching the overlook, Matthias spent the morning chasing the perfect photograph. Each new angle looked slightly better than the last, and eventually he leaned farther over the edge than he should have for one final shot. Looking for something to steady himself, he reached toward what appeared to be a harmless plant growing from the rocks below. Just below the edge was what looked like a thick piece of vegetation sticking out from the rocks. Without realizing what he was touching, Matthias grabbed onto it for support while holding his camera in the other hand. The plant, he expected to save his balance, was actually a black rat snake warming itself on the rocks. That's such an unexpected thing to find your hand touching when you're expecting a branch or plant. The moment Matthias grabbed it, the plant moved. Realizing the thing he was using as a handhold was alive, he instinctively pulled back in surprise. In a split second, the harmless-looking support he trusted became the reason he lost his balance. Without a secure handhold or anchor point, his footing slipped and he fell over the overlook. Matthias plunged onto the rocky slope below, striking multiple large rocks as he fell. The impact caused severe injuries to his legs, pelvis, spine, and head, while his camera was thrown from his hand and landed nearby. Alone on a lightly traveled trail, he had no way to get help. When Matthias failed to return home that evening, his family began to worry. Before long, volunteers and authorities were searching trails and overlooks he was known to visit. The search continued into the following day, when he was eventually found at the base of the overlook and pronounced dead at the scene. I can only think about the worry his family must have felt while waiting for any news. Investigators examining the area documented suitable habitat for black rat snakes among the rocks near the overlook. Wildlife specialists later confirmed that the species commonly rests on exposed rocky ledges to absorb warmth from the sun, making such an encounter entirely plausible. After Matthias was located at the base of the overlook, authorities determined that he had suffered fatal injuries during the fall and could not have survived without immediate medical assistance. No evidence suggested that anyone else had been involved, and the incident was treated as a tragic accident. What stays with me is that there was no one else to blame, just a chain of events that happened too quickly. In the weeks afterward, friends and family organized a memorial hike at a safer overlook in the region. They brought along Matthias's camera and reflected on the places he had enjoyed exploring. Among the photographs recovered from the memory card was a landscape image captured shortly before the accident, preserving one final view of the valley he had traveled so far to photograph.